Hi, everybody. My name is Jared Milrad. I'm the founder of Movie Karma. We are the nonprofit organization that created our podcast here called Rewriting Hollywood, which I'm sure, as many of you know, focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion, representation, and social impact in Hollywood, and really looking at the underrepresented as well as social impact storytellers around the world who are fostering social change through the power of story. Today, I'm really excited to have a special guest who has come through our A Show for a Change Film Festival, made a really terrific documentary called The Trust Crisis. Our guest today is Nathalie Kantaris Diaz, who is the director behind the project. Again, it's a really fascinating documentary. It looks at issues of trust, trust in our government, trust in each other, our politics, our policies, and how trust kind of infuses and affects all of those issues. It's really fascinating, really, really relevant. And I'm excited to have Nathalie on the show today. So Nathalie, thanks so much for joining us. Excited to have you on.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's dive in. Now, we saw that you are a multi-talented first-class Oxford graduate. You are currently working as an in-house producer, director, and documentary researcher for Silverfish Films, and you've received a Master of Arts in Film and Philosophy at King's College London. Tell us a little bit more, if you would, Nathalie, about your journey. When did you think you might go into filmmaking?
Yeah, sure. So I think actually right from my childhood, I was always really interested in film. So yeah, my dad actually is a professor of sort of Latin American culture and film in Cambridge, where I grew up. So yeah, I just grew up with loads and loads of DVDs of sort of obscure like art house documentaries and films and everywhere basically. So yeah, it was like as a bored teenager, sort of every few evenings I'd sort of pick up a new film and watch it. So I think it started off just being a sort of window into a different culture for me, sort of living in middle class Cambridge, just getting transported suddenly to sort of a city in Argentina or a favela in Brazil. It was just that sort of sparked my interest. And then I guess I always had that in the back of my mind that I wanted to work in documentary. And I then studied languages at university and had that as well as sort of, that would leave the sort of path open for me to maybe carry on into the documentary sphere, just with those sort of cultural encounters with different people. And then I was really lucky to have a tutor in Italian at university who was a sort of film specialist, so a specialist in modern Italian cinema. And I ended up doing a thesis on sort of comparing different modern Italian films, and that really sort of cemented my interest. And then I went on to do a master's in London in film and philosophy. So I really came from quite a sort of academic background into the film sphere, but then during that master's I did do one practical sort of documentary module, and I sort of filmed a Colombian market in London that was sort of threatened by gentrification, and absolutely just loved that story, and it really just cemented that idea of just encountering different cultures and using my languages and all of that, and then started working for Silverfish Films, and there we go.
Yeah, and here we are. And you mentioned using your different languages. I saw that you're a quadrilingual, multi-talented, multilingual person. I want to hear more about that. If that, that's fascinating that you have that ability to jump between cultures and languages. How has that come in handy as you've started to develop your interest in filmmaking?
Yeah, so I mean, my mum is Colombian, so I grew up bilingual, and again, that sort of having my foot between two different cultures was, I think, just really priceless thing for me. So yeah, that sort of again got me thinking about studying more languages. And I did French and Italian at university, and yeah, it's been actually really, really useful. I mean, just being able to sort of tap into different cultural bubbles, even within what a certain city, and tell stories that don't usually get featured, and voices that don't usually get heard because they can't communicate properly with, I don't know, yeah, dominant sort of media narratives here in the UK. I think that I've really loved using my languages to do that. And I also at one point lived in Paris, and I worked for a little bit for Reuters TV in Paris, and sort of obviously, yeah, used my French and English there to sort of report on stories, talking to people in French and then write them up in English. And I think, yeah, just that sort of idea of marrying film and a love of languages has just been, yeah, sort of central narrative to my life up until now.
Yeah, I mean, I could see how it'd be really useful and give you a window into other cultures, especially as someone making documentary projects. I wanted to ask about any mentors you've had. It's something that we're always fascinated by. If you've had people along the way who've guided you or supported you, and what advice did any of those types of folks give to you that might have been helpful?
Yeah. So I think my dad actually, from a very early age, just the fact that he was sort of really embedded in studying the cultural output of sort of filmmakers and documentarians. I think just I was so privileged to have been brought up in that sort of atmosphere, where culture was really treated as a really serious, really beautiful thing. And yeah, my friends always say actually, like while they were watching Disney films, I was watching these sort of, I don't know, random documentaries. Still haven't seen films like The Lion King or things like that. Yeah. But yeah, I guess I think that sort of really opened my eyes to that sort of thing. But then in terms of actual mentors, I think that came later when I moved to London, and I could really sort of embed myself within the cultural documentary making scene here. So I think that literally the day after I moved to London, I started volunteering at a documentary film festival here called Open City Docs. And it's, yeah, really beautiful, wonderful festival that sort of celebrates the avant-garde of documentary filmmaking. And I just met loads of amazing people there who were just really interested in the same things as I was interested in, and loved going to all the talks and the Q&As, and chatting to people. And I think that's where, yeah, just embedding myself in that atmosphere was where the mentoring sort of really started for me.
Fascinating. Yeah, I could see how that would be a great learning atmosphere for a young filmmaker. I wonder too, like on the question of representation, before we get to the film, there's still unfortunately not a lot of female filmmakers, such as documentarians, that we see celebrated. We know that, obviously we meet tons of folks around the world who are doing awesome work, who often are underrepresented and not getting the attention they should. I wonder what that journey was like for you, as a female filmmaker. Did you feel that you had to kind of chart your own path, or did you have people that were guiding you and kind of made you feel at home in this industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, it's weird actually, because in Silverfish Films we make a lot of sort of short docs and campaign videos, everything with sort of social impact values, but often it would be sort of 3-person teams, and I really like working with all female crews, and it would be just sort of 3 of us, and people would be like, oh wow, like, oh, a team of just 3 women. And the fact, obviously that's great to celebrate that, but the fact that they're still sort of commenting on that as if that's something out of the ordinary. Like if it were 3 men, people wouldn't necessarily comment on that. So I think, yeah, you do definitely notice, yeah, the underrepresentation, even on sort of meetings with other creatives and other film professionals, it's often really dominated by men, and maybe men of a certain age, and yeah, often white. So yeah, it's definitely something really noticeable. But I think, again, if you sort of, what I've really enjoyed doing is meeting other women who, yeah, sort of young up and coming filmmakers, for example, like in those festivals, and just sort of really making a community, and seeing that actually there are so many people out there, and sort of teaming together and collaborating can yeah, produce really wonderful things.
Right. Yeah, that's really cool that you started to find your kind of your crew there, as you say, and have pushed forward that lack of representation to change it. I wanted to talk about your award-winning film, The Trust Crisis, which we celebrate as part of our Show for a Change Film Festival. It explores whether declining trust in politics may be one of the most threatening crises we face today, and whether the very concept of democracy is at threat globally. You have top academics in the field in the film, you have journalists, experts, you have politicians, you have a lot of ordinary citizens from around the world, especially the UK, US, and Denmark. They talk about how they feel about politics, but also whether or not they trust politicians, whether they trust each other, and how we can create more trustworthy or trusting democratic societies. Tell us a little bit more before we dive into a lot of the kind of really fascinating points of that. Tell us a little more, if you and Natalie, about like why you decided to go down this route and what interested you about the topic. How did you start exploring it?
Yeah, so actually it was born out of a collaboration with a group of academics, working sort of here in the UK, and actually in Harvard as well in the US, and they research trust in politics. So their group is called TrustGov. And we were sort of talking to them about potential film ideas, and it's yeah, basically the question of whether we trust politicians is just, it feels so topical at the moment, and they were suggesting actually we're living through a trust crisis, and it's not something, it's something that's sort of bubbling away underneath the surface, but then sort of comes out in massive sort of waves, like in January, last January, with the Capitol riots, and
Right.
that, yeah, it's just, it feels so topical. And then we started sort of, yeah, talking about the repercussions of that, and is democracy even at threat? Just, it's such a huge question. So we were just fascinated. We would have sort of calls every week chatting about the topic, just trying to flesh out different strands and different countries where just sort of different repercussions are happening. And basically we could just talk about that topic for hours and hours with those academics. So that's what sort of sparked our interest initially. Yes.
Okay, so that makes sense. This is very topical, very, very much hot topics, definitely here in the US, and obviously the other countries you profile in the film. Tell us a little bit about like what angle you thought as you started developing the film and started meeting with perhaps some of the subjects of the film, academics and others. What were some of the themes that started to emerge for you that you felt like were kind of bubbling up, that you feel like sort of give you the focus under that umbrella of trust?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the question of whether we are actually living through a crisis of trust at the moment, because many people sort of think that we aren't. There's always been a level of sort of skepticism and cynicism in government. So I guess exploring the question of, firstly, are we living through a crisis of trust? Then also, what actually is trust in politics, and sort of how important is it that we trust politicians? Because obviously, complete trust in the political system wouldn't lead to anything good. Nothing would ever happen. It'd be complete chaos. But then too much sort of blind trust and blind faith in politicians is something that we don't want either. And you see that can lead to sort of dictatorships and anything sort of happening. And actually, interestingly, China has some of the highest levels of recorded political trust. So that's an interesting point there. So we were sort of comparing sort of differing levels of trust and what's the ideal level of trust in politicians, and is there anywhere that's sort of come close to reaching that? So then we started thinking, okay, what sort of case study countries can we employ to start thinking about these differing levels of trust? So we thought the US came up as quite a clear example of sort of quite extreme distrust. So in a certain set of figures, it's only 14% of people in the US trust politicians, which is crazy.
Staggering.
And then and then we did want to sort of have a focus on the UK because we were all based there, and that was sort of a middle ground of sort of around 34%, I think, trust politicians. And then the Scandinavian countries always come to mind as sort of slightly more stable, trusting societies where everything sort of works well. And we started sort of researching, and Denmark came up as one of the countries that people called it the sort of Danish ideal, and politicians around the world always sort of cite Denmark as this example of great welfare state and great education, and everything just functions really nicely. So we came to those 3 case studies and sort of took a sort of Goldilocks approach to the film. So too much, maybe too little, and in between. But then with the Denmark example, I think it's about 50% of people trust government there. But what also came out of that example was that actually it's also quite a homogenous society. So is there a sort of price to pay for higher trust? Because a lot of people that we talked to there said, it works well because everyone sort of looks like each other and everyone trusts each other and this, that, and the other. And we were like, okay, well, I don't think that model would sort of work in the more multicultural societies of the US and the UK, and nor would we really want it to work, because you don't want a society where everything's sort of homogenized and and the sort of cultural differences in cultural communities and bubbles that exist in those societies are sort of flattened, which is what they're sort of doing in Denmark. And they have some of the most restrictionist immigration policies in Europe, and sort of demolishing migrant ghettos, as they call them, in Copenhagen. So that was a really interesting finding to come out of the documentary as well.
Right. Yeah, that point about homogenous societies like Denmark and maybe even Sweden or Finland, to varying degrees, how they seem to have more trust in their governments versus the multicultural societies. Like, what do you think? What do you think that tells us in terms of how in a place like the U.S. we can work to build, like you said, maybe more, informed, educated trust, but not blind trust, but sort of a sense that, hey, if we put in the right people and we pay attention, we can trust our government and our leaders. Like, how do we get to that place in places that are more, diverse and maybe a little more inclusive?
Yeah, I think it's about sort of finding points of commonality that aren't linked to sort of say how people look or where they're from originally. So those could be sort of community groups or unions, or people need to sort of feel like they're unified in other ways and other purposes, and yeah, another one solution that we looked at in the documentary was actually citizens' assemblies. So sort of bringing loads of citizens, randomly selected citizens together, a sort of representation of all different parts of the population. So from, say, bankers to cleaners to immigrants to people from all around the country, and having them sort of consult on what needs to change in society, and sort of having experts there to sort of guide them and give sort of information that's verified, so we're avoiding the sort of misinformation craziness as well. And yeah, having them sort of work on different policies and policy ideas, and that's one way of sort of empowering citizens directly, I guess. So it's, yeah, with a relationship of trust, I guess, like with any relationship of trust, it's sort of, the government has to trust in the citizens in order to get trust back from them.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it's a mutuality, isn't it? It's a two-way street that needs to exist for the democracy of the government to function. I wanted to talk about that in misinformation bit, because you covered it quite a bit in the documentary. It was fascinating on the section on conspiracy theorists and why conspiracies thrive in certain places. We know in the US, they unfortunately do really, really well and thrive, particularly on social media. And there's an interesting point made in the documentary that conspiracy people who are conspiracy theorists or believe in conspiracies tend to be actually kind of like very engaged. Like, they're not people, they're sort of stereotyped that they're folks who are just gullible, but they're often people who are actually devouring a lot of information and are really interested, but of course they're devouring, kind of taking the wrong information. Talk a little bit more about that, if you would, in terms of its impact on trust, and why perhaps through your research, a place like the US seems to be very susceptible to conspiracies spreading and kind of affecting our view of our government.
Yeah, so I think, because with the US, you're starting from a place of a very polarized society. So you've got people, it's almost, some people have described it as like a civil war, a quasi civil war that's sort of bubbling away between Republicans and Democrats, and it's sort of getting more and more extreme, and every time a sort of president of the other color gets in, it sort of polarizes another group. And then, when Biden came in, people saying that was a fraud and all of this stuff. So it's getting worse and worse. So I think as then people also feel more disengaged from the government, and feel, if they're losing their jobs or it's not going well economically for them, just getting more and more disengaged from sort of the reality of life. I think then if you take all those feelings and that polarization and you put it on the online sphere, it just gets exacerbated, and you have sort of online groups targeting those disaffected people as well to increase their following or to get their message out there. And it's, yeah, it gets exacerbated to a completely next level. And I think, yeah, that's one of the really sort of nefarious and dangerous aspects of distrust that we're seeing in the modern world, and is a really scary sort of consequence of the trust crisis, and something that sort of, it's almost a vicious circle. As it happens more, it just gets worse and worse, and it's, yes, sort of spiraling out of control.
Yeah, it does seem that way. It can be quite quite frightening, especially when, like you said, people don't kind of believe, like, they're just so divorced from reality. Not only do they distrust their government, they don't believe that the government essentially exists in the way that everyone else seems to think, based on the shared reality we think we're all living in. So on that point, I wonder, like, obviously we could have been left really hopeless by the film, but you have a great section on, like, kind of what can we do, and you talked about citizen assemblies, which are fascinating, that can kind of recommend policies and changes, perhaps build some more trust in government through that vein. But what other changes or ways do you think that folks who are listening to this can can maybe foster more trust amongst their neighbors, their communities, in our government, and hopefully rekindle that sense of connection.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of what the government can do, sort of more regulation on sort of social media and all of those things, and also really sort of fostering those relationships and empowering citizens. And in terms of, yeah, I guess, social trust, so interpersonal trust really feeds into political trust. So yeah, it really is about sort of increasing trust in communities, as you mentioned. So I guess joining community groups and community centres, and just sort of stopping to have a chat with your neighbour, or just making an effort to have a chat with someone who has come from a different place, or has grown up in a different bubble to you, or just anything that sort of brings diverse members of communities together. I think that's just such a powerful thing. And even actually sort of coming back to what we were talking about at the beginning, sort of watching films and documentaries that can bring you into different bubbles and that can cause you to have encounters with people who you wouldn't usually sort of come across in your daily sphere or your daily life. I think that's a really powerful thing as well.
Yeah, it is, and that's a great point. It's something that we really try to foster as well. And I think you've done through your film is looking for stories and people's experiences that are different from our own, so that we can connect in those ways. On that point, I was going to ask my last question about just sort of the social impact of filmmaking. It's something that we spend a lot of time working on and highlighting, and also trying to make filmmaking and storytelling more inclusive and equitable and representative. What are your thoughts on some of those issues that the industry is currently, grappling with, maybe in some cases for the first time, unfortunately? And how can we make, the storytelling more impactful and inclusive, do you think?
Yeah, I think we as creators and the film industry has such an important responsibility, because we are creating dominant narratives that people are going to be seeing, and that's going to be influencing new generations and all of this. So I think it's really sort of opening up the industry and sort of unstereotyping the narratives that the industry is putting out there, unromanticizing them, maybe diversifying them, definitely. And to do that, yeah, you have to open up the industry and bring people who have had different lived experiences come in and be sort of creating that content and writing those stories. And I guess that's, potentially through mentoring as well. You can sort of attract different people to come in and sort of follow those routes, and just really making an effort to sort of to bring in new generations of women and people of color, and just people who have had completely different experiences to the dominant narratives that are being put out there in the industry at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen to that. I think all those pathways are key, and really, really important. The last few questions we have for you, Nathalie, is we call it rapid fire sections. These are sort of quick layer questions we like to ask to close out our conversations. And the first one we had for you was on your language skills. You've been able to learn, as you said, multiple languages. So we're curious, like, how do you use and train those languages and keep them fresh and keep them active for you?
Actually, through watching films. I love just watching films without subtitles and just immersing myself in that culture and that language, and then just sort of chat to people, whoever, in that language after, just even if they don't understand.
That's cool. That's really, really cool. We don't have, as you probably know, the best language training, I would say, in the US versus other countries. So it's something I think is really important. in schools and beyond. We're curious if you have a ritual or some process you do to get creative as you're going to make a film, or if you're on set. Like, do you have anything you come back to as a ritual to get in a kind of creative mindset?
I guess if I'm in a sort of solo creative atmosphere, I would just sit down and write. So in the morning, I might just wake up and just write whatever I'm thinking and feeling, even if it's not related to the film. And that just sort of, yeah, gets creative juices flowing. Or if it's, yeah, on set and we're going to interview someone, I think just having a chat with that person about their life and about everything just not related to the film. And getting to know them as a person, I think that just strikes up a beautiful sort of creative partnership for what's about to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And the last question we had for you was, if you could travel, if you could do some time travel, if you could travel anywhere in time in the past, we're curious, like, what period would you want to go to? And if there's someone you'd want to share a meal with during that time period?
Oh, that's a good question. I think probably to meet one of the sort of Native American tribes that were in South America before Christopher Columbus came. So maybe, yeah, like the Mayans or something. I think I'd be just so fascinated to see those cultures and to have dinner maybe with one of the tribe leaders or something.
Wow, that's a really, really cool answer. Yeah, a lot of history there. Of course, we unfortunately don't know enough about here in the U.S. and other parts of the world. But yeah, this was really fantastic to have you on the show, Nathalie, and to feature your film as part of our Show for Change Film Festival. Again, our guest is Nathalie Kantaris Diaz. The film is called The Trust Crisis. I hope folks will check it out and take action on some of the issues that are raised in the film. It's really fantastic. Again, Nathalie, thank you so much for being on the show. It was a pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much, Sherrod. It's been a pleasure to chat.